Hi, Mike Brantley, auctioneer, here again. Today talking about different types of auctions. Now, one could argue there's all types of auctions, types of property, where it's located, types of products being sold, different auctioneers, online, simulcast, live, all kinds of types. But from a legal standpoint, while I'm not an attorney, I do know that in 50 states, it's held that there are two legal types of auctions, that auctions basically divide into one of two types. They're known as with reserve and without reserve. The with reserve auction, there can be all kinds of reserves. There could be a published minimum bid. There could be a reserve that's held in secret. There could be a reserve price that's maybe published different from sometimes the minimum bid. There could be seller confirmation of the high bid, yes or no. Once the high bid is reached, then the seller says, yep, I'll take that, or no, I won't. And there's also seller bidding, which constitutes a reserve. So the seller could just bid against other bidders and hope that that bidding produced a desirable result for the seller. In a without reserve auction, also known as an absolute auction, we can't have any of that. An absolute auction is, by definition, the definition I've characterized as the genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder regardless of price. I'm going to say it again. The genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder regardless of price. So you can't have seller bidding, can't have minimum bids, can't have reserves, can't have seller confirmation, except in one case, and that's called a forced sale, where the seller is forced to sell or someone else is deciding for the seller, we're going to sell your property, such as a foreclosure, repossession, court-ordered, enforcing a lien, those types of things where the seller doesn't get to decide. Someone else gets to decide. Well, in those cases, the seller can bid, can participate, and thus there's a form of reserve in those, even if the auction was advertised absolute. The seller could still bid. You couldn't have so-called minimum bids or reserves, but the seller can protect their position by participating. And lastly, some people say, well, there's 3 types of auctions, or 4 types of auctions, or 5 types of auctions. I think in Kansas, there was a case where they said there were 3 types. For instance, here's what they'll say. Well, there's absolute, there's with reserve, and then there's seller confirmation, which is a third part. But seller confirmation is a reserve auction. With reserve auction is a with reserve auction. In other words, that third type is really a different flavor, if you will, of a with reserve auction. I believe the National Association of Realtors published a paper years ago, as I recall looking at it, saying, gee, who wrote this? There were maybe 5 types of auctions. And there's not 5 types of auctions. There's not 5 legal types of auctions, even though maybe some courts and maybe some attorneys have argued, well, there's 3 or there's 4 or there's 5. There's 2 types at the very top of this discussion. It either is selling with some sort of reserve, or it's not selling with any type of reserve. Of course, minus the forced sale situation where the seller can participate. What's important for auctioneers to realize is that you need to, as I've told countless people in classes and seminars I've given around the United States, that you need to, as I say it, stay in your lane. In other words, you have a lot up for auction. I'm selling a car, and I'm selling it absolute. Well, I need to keep that absolute throughout that lot to the conclusion of selling that lot. Can't get bids on it and then change it to a with reserve auction if I'm not happy with the price. Stay in my lane. In a with reserve auction, as well here, stay in your lane. selling it with reserve. I've got a car selling with reserve. Even if I reach the reserve price, I should not say, well, now it's selling absolute, because that would be, in essence, some people say, well, I'm changing the type of auction. I'm crossing lanes here in my example. I would argue you're actually more likely canceling the entire with reserve auction and moving over to an absolute auction and canceling all those bids, and therefore maybe you don't have enough to satisfy the reserve. So auctioneers should, as we've said, stay in your lane. Whatever that lot, whatever that item, whatever that property is that's currently up for bid, if it's selling with reserve, keep it with reserve the entire time. Say sold, and then move to the next lot. Now the next lot could be absolute, but then we've changed lanes and now we're selling something absolute all the way to sold. Then we're done with that lot. And then we can decide which lane we want to be in for the next lot. But once we get in a lane and put something up for auction, call for bids, we need to stay in that lane. And you notice we've been talking about 2 lanes because there's 2 types of auctions. Again, Mike Brantley, Auctioneer. Pleasure to be with you today. Keep an eye here for more upcoming videos, and we appreciate you tuning in.